All right, let's get cooking. Welcome to the latest edition of Chin Check Sports Radio. I'm your host, JD. I want to thank you all for taking the time out to join us. And as always, we welcome any suggestions, feedback, comments, and criticisms, which improves the quality of our program, which ultimately improves your listening experience. Before we get started, we want to send all of you our thank yous for your tremendous support. Slowly but surely, it seems like people are discovering us and they are discovering what we do, and we get a lot of positive feedback. And as we stated numerous times, all we're simply doing, we are sharing our experiences and our passions and the things that we enjoy doing with you all. So thank you for your tremendous support, and we will continue to bring you quality programming. We want to jump right into the review from this Saturday night, Fight Night in Atlanta, where as you see that this is aptly titled Fight Night in the ATL Part 2. If you go back, we did a previous broadcast, Fight Night in the ATL back in December of 2019 that featured Gervonta Tank Davis versus Yuriorkis Gamboa. Now, for those of us who are hardcore fight fans, we didn't really put a lot of stock into that fight because if you're really aware of the nature of boxing, the whole dog eats dog, the whole old lion meets a young lion, you have a young up-and-coming fighter who's being groomed to be a star, meets a guy who was once a great fighter or close to being a great fighter, or you can say a good fighter. As a young star is rising, the older fighter's star is starting to diminish, and of course he has to knock off that older fighter who still is a valid name to a lot of people. But for those of us who are in the know, we know that it's actually a mismatch, but that's just the nature of boxing. So we definitely reviewed that fight, and it turns out Gervonta Davis is going to be one of the next major stars in boxing, but specifically a lot of his fights, the last few of his fights, are in the city of Atlanta. As we have mentioned before, Atlanta is a great boxing city. Myself going to different sports bars, how the sports bars get packed, knowing how Atlanta itself is a very transient city. A lot of people come from all over the country and they live in the Atlanta, or what they call the Atlanta metro area. And it's some of that, especially with the two stadiums, with the State Farm and the Mercedes-Benz Stadium. I've said this before, Atlanta has potential to be a major fight city. The only thing that Atlanta does not have compared to maybe your Vegas is obviously are your casinos, but I definitely say I can put Atlanta on the map as a great boxing city. So this particular night, you had Gervonta Davis fighting against Mario Barrios, fighting for a junior welterweight or super lightweight, or simply put, 140-pound title. Now, what was significant about that fight, that Gervonta Davis, who held titles at the super featherweight division, which is 126 pounds to 130 pounds, and the lightweight division between 130 and 135 pounds, was going for his third title in 3 different weight classes. That's pretty impressive, especially at the age of 26 years old. Now, there are some people who will say that, the people who Gervonta won were not the best guys in those divisions. That's an argument for another day. That's through no fault of his own, because with the panoply of title belts in boxing, the WBC, the WBA, the IBF, then you have sometimes the WBA have designated one guy as their super champion, while another guy holds the WBA belt. You have the interim WBC champion, while another guy is an actual WBC champion. So this is how boxing has kind of cannibalized itself, where now if you beat the guy, he has a title, but he's not really the champion, but he's considered a titleist. But some guys, they still count it as winning a world title. So that's a conversation for another day. Now, Davis going up in weight, which is pretty big, against a guy who stands 5'10" versus Davis, who stands 5'5.5". So it presented a very interesting fight. Again, anytime a fighter moves up in weight, it presents a challenge in and of itself, because does that fighter with his skill set translate to a much higher weight class? Will his punching power travel with him to a higher weight class? does the bigger fighter use his size as an advantage to keep the smaller fighter at bay? There's an old saying in boxing, or really in combat sports, a good big man will always beat a good small man. Now you have those exceptions where you have an exceptional smaller guy fighting against a much larger opponent. And I go back to Roy Jones Jr., who was the undisputed light heavyweight champion of the world, moving up 2 weight classes to fight John Ruiz, who is a heavyweight titleist. And Roy Jones absolutely dominated that fight. So again, you have an exceptional smaller guy beating a good bigger guy. Let's take a look at Bernard Hopkins. Bernard Hopkins, the undisputed, well, at the time, let me phrase that. He was the former undisputed middleweight champion of the world, lost his titles to Jermaine Taylor in 2 very close fights, moves up 2 weight classes to the light heavyweight division and challenges Antonio Tarver, who at that time was recognized as the lineal light heavyweight champion of the world, dominates Tarver. So again, you have Bernard Hopkins, who was my favorite all-time great fighter, a top all-time fighter, against Tarver, who was seen as really a good fighter. His reputation was really built on that knockout win versus Roy Jones in their second fight. So again, you have instances where a great smaller fighter has beaten and quite frankly soundly whipped a good bigger fighter. So these are some of the advantages that Barrios had going into that fight, being a much larger fighter, taller, longer reach, and really from the opening bell, I had Mario Barrios winning the first 4 rounds. And more so, he kept Tank at bay. He kept jabbing. Tank, I felt, really didn't have a good offensive output. Clearly, if you watch that fight, Barrios was clearly cognizant of Tank's power, especially in his left hand, because he kept his right hand close to his face. I'm talking about close to his body as possible. So clearly there was a strategy there that was implemented by his trainer, Virgil Hunter. And I gave Barrios the first 4 rounds. Now, you saw Tank having to change strategies. Well, now fighting from the outside is not going to work because he's being outlanded, even though I felt that he showed a lot defensively and dodging a lot of good shots. A lot of good punches did connect on Tank. I don't know if Barrios has that earth-shattering punching power, but he did hit stiff enough. And like Tank can take a punch, he has a pretty good chin. And actually, if you look at the construction of his face, he does have a strong jawline. So to me, I think I can say now that Tank has a pretty good chin. So defensively, I thought he looked good. He knew that he had to change strategy where he cannot stand from the outside because he was losing those rounds. And I'm going to get to why that was important in a few minutes here. So he changed his strategy. He starts walking down the much bigger fighter. So put that in perspective. The 5'5" guy is walking down the 5'9" the 5'10" guy. He's walking him down. He's backing him against the ropes. He started to change strategy. He knows at this point he has to make this a chest-to-chest, up-close and personal fight, which he did, scoring 2 hellacious knockdowns in the 8th round. And really, at that point, I had Tank slowly start to creep his way into the fight. I gave Tank round 5. You can make an argument of round 6 and really round 7. And those 2 knockdowns, I felt, pulled Tank ahead in that fight by 1 point. Barrios came back and won the 9th round. I thought he did a good job of composing himself. It looked like Tank might have punched himself out a little bit in that 8th round trying to go for the knockout, which is what he was supposed to do. I was in the crowd, and it was a great atmosphere. And I was telling people who I was sitting next to, he needs to start all over again, take a deep breath, don't punch himself out. And I thought he kind of got tired a little bit towards the end of the 8th round. But again, it was a huge round. You scored 10-7 with the 2 knockdowns. I had Tank ahead by 1. I gave Barrios the 9th round. So really, I had that an even fight going into the 10th round. Now, in the arena, Floyd Mayweather, who was one of the promoters for the fight, is a mentor for Gervonta Davis. And of course, Floyd Mayweather is the greatest fighter that I've seen in my lifetime by far, was speaking in the corner. And of course, my little brother watching on TV knew what Floyd was saying, what I didn't know what Floyd was saying. Now, I had a problem with that because I felt it was too many people in the corner, where Davis had his trainer, where it's his trainer's job to do all the instructing in the corner, while you have Floyd talking to him on the outside. And there's too many chefs in the kitchen. They tend to spoil the broth. So, and I didn't agree with Floyd kind of interjecting himself in the corner, which you can say from a technical standpoint, he shouldn't have been in the first place. He's a promoter. He will sit down in the seat, but it is Floyd Mayweather, so we're going to give him a pass on that. But then when I found out what Floyd told him, that he was behind on the scorecards, that seemed to be the motivation that Gervonta Davis needed to really put Barrios away, in which he did with an emphatic TKO in the 11th round. And it was an action-packed environment, being there live. The crowd went nuts. It clearly was a pro-Davis crowd in that stadium by far. Again, he's had other fights in Atlanta. He's from Baltimore, Maryland, which is, I would say, a 2-hour plane ride from Atlanta. The drive from Baltimore, you can say, is maybe a 8 to 9 hour, maybe a 10-hour drive. So people from Baltimore came. I know in my section there was a lot of people from the Baltimore, the Washington, D.C. area that came to the fight. It definitely was a pro-Tank crowd. I will also say this, there was a lot of ratchetness in the crowd, with people literally putting their feet on the damn seats, but that's another conversation for another day. So Gervonta Davis, at the age of 26 years old, winning his third world title in 3 different weight classes. Now again, was Mario Barrios the top guy at that weight class? Some might make an argument he wasn't, but you beat the opponents that's in front of you. I was impressed with him for a bunch of reasons. Is number one, as a young fighter, sometimes you used to just walking in there and just overwhelming guys, where people are really intimidated of you, or your natural physical gifts, they carry you through the day and you don't have to rely on anything else. Davis was behind on points big time on my scorecard, as well as Steve Farhood's unofficial scorecard. Now, I believe when they released the scorecards, the official scorecards, they had Tank ahead. I didn't know the actual numbers, but at the time of the stoppage, you can make an argument that Tank was winning the fight. But at the time where Mayweather was giving him the instructions that he needed, that he was behind on points, I can see why Floyd thought that way. So when you're in there, and you're in there with a tough guy who you cannot just knock out with one punch, to be down on 4 scorecards, to change strategies, that showed a level of maturity. That shows a level of reaching deep. Then you knock the guy down. Then a guy comes back and wins the 9th round. The poise that he showed in that type of environment, in a very tough fight against a larger opponent, my respect went up for that kid a lot. I knew he had the natural ability. I knew he had the punching power, and his punching power is absolutely incredible. And believe it or not, I believe he's very underrated defensively. His footwork is very nice footwork. Very nice footwork. And I hope he continues to develop his skill set around his power, because a lot of guys who have knockout power tend to neglect other aspects of their game and solely focus on their punching power. And I thought a lot of his footwork, his head movement, the bobbing and weaving, the ducking and slipping punches, I thought it was a thing of beauty. I was really impressed by Tank in this fight. He showed me a lot. I'm not going to question the quality of his opposition. I'm going to give this kid his utmost respect, his 100% due on an absolutely amazing performance. This kid is really kind of pulling himself ahead of the pack as the star, as a true star in the sport of boxing. Now, even though he holds titles at 140 pounds, but really his main opposition, in my opinion, now this is just one man's opinion, drop down, back down to the lightweight division, because folks, there are some innocent fights in that division. While you have Ryan Garcia, the social media star, who's undefeated, again, even though Tank seems to be now being pushed to the forefront of being the biggest star, but Ryan Garcia himself is a big social media star with all his training videos and his fast hands. So that's a fight that can definitely be, that should definitely be made. You have Devin the Dream Haney, who's also undefeated, who's a WBC lightweight champion, while Ryan Garcia is the interim WBC lightweight champion. Yes, go figure. That should be another interesting fight. If he wants to stay at 140, you have the 140-pound champion, Josh Taylor. And another interesting fight, depending on how physically this fighter will mature, is one Shakur Stevenson, who's fighting at super featherweight. So you figure maybe that's a possibility later on down the road. Now, ladies and gentlemen, what's interesting about the majority of those fighters, Gervonta Davis, as we said, is 26 years old. Ryan Garcia is 22 years old. Devin Haney is 22 years old. Shakur Stevenson is 23 years old. Josh Taylor, quote, the older guy, is 30 years old. Folks, you have some top fighters who are under the age of 25 years old. That says a lot. I believe boxing is in good hands going forward. You have a lot of young fighters, clearly talented fighters. Now the question is, do you make these fights now? Because here's the other problem with boxing, and this is what I call the Floyd Mayweather effect. Every fighter defines themselves by their undefeated record. All these guys I mentioned are undefeated. Now, we look at it as, especially in the era of Mayweather, if he was to lose one fight, in most people's minds, it would have discredited every single win that he ever had. Even that farce against Logan Paul, people are still trying to somewhat discredit Floyd's record for not being able to knock the guy out, even though he clearly whipped his ass. So these fighters are undefeated. I hope there's not a protecting of their undefeated record, because in the mind of the boxing public, when a guy loses, all of a sudden he's not good anymore and just throw him away to the trash heap. I don't agree with that. Floyd Mayweather, Joe Gasaghi, Ricardo Lopez, and Rocky Marciano and Andre Ward are a rare exception of fighters to go through this tremendous sport undefeated. All great fighters lose. Well, you don't want to say all, I just gave you other great fighters who never lost. Most great fighters lose. Muhammad Ali, Henry Armstrong, Bernard Hopkins, Marvin Hagler, Julio Cesar Chavez, Roy Jones, Mike Tyson, Pernell Sweet Whitaker, Felix Trinidad, Harry Greb, Archie Moore, George Foreman, Joe Frazier, Larry Holmes, Lennox Lewis, Evander Holyfield. These guys lose, and guess what? They're still seen as all-time great fighters. So now the question that promoters have, the Al Haymans and the Premier Boxing Champion and Bob Arum, the decision that these guys have to make is, do you wait a couple years to make these guys bigger stars for them to start fighting each other, or do you let them fight these peripheral challengers and challenges to keep building their name, to make an easy check, and to protect undefeated records? Or do you let these young lions fight each other now? Remember, a lot of these guys barely had 20-something fights on their record, where back then, it will be a big fight if a guy had 30, sometimes 40 fights on his ring record. But you have a bunch of young, quality fighters now who are relatively young pups compared to what we saw from yesteryear. So these are decisions that promoters are going to have to make. Where do we just put them in there against one another? Obviously, the old saying, somebody's old has to go. Now, does that take away the marketing of that fighter, the fact that he no longer has undefeated record? Or do we fight these other challenges to keep building up the record, to keep drumming up interest, where we can put these fighters against one another, one day to make big money, because that's what this is about. So those are something that the promoters are going to have to think about. And I personally, for one, I'm definitely excited as a hardcore fight fan, as a lover of the sport, to see there's some young fighters, especially in that lightweight division. And eventually lightweights, they move up, they become 140 pounders, they become 147 pounders at welterweight. And there's already talk of Davis maybe moving up to welterweight one day, so we'll see about that. So I, for one, am excited. And one fighter who I intentionally left out is really recognized as the lineal lightweight champion of the world, and that's 23-year-old Teofimo Lopez. Now, why I bring him up, which leads me into our next review, which was Vasyl Lomachenko, the man who Lopez beat last year in a great fight, beating the brakes off of Masayoshi Nakatani. Now, every analyst was saying it was an interesting fight. How was Lomachenko after his first loss? And I've discussed, when guys lose their first fight from a from a psychoanalytic standpoint. I have discussed this before. So there was some excuses making. Again, I've talked about this, that Lomachenko might have had a bad shoulder. So people wanted to see physically how he was and mentally how did he recover from suffering his first loss, especially being the favorite in that fight, really being recognized as a top pound-for-pound fighter in the world, and beat the brakes off of Nakatani, which hopefully, with Teofimo Lopez Sr. making his way to the ring, talking to the announcers, we're going to hope that when Lopez gets past his mandatory challenge, we get to see that rematch at the end of 2021 or the beginning of 2022. So again, and keep this in mind, I've named all those undefeated fighters, and I forget about a guy who just 7-8 months ago was considered the best in boxing, and that was Lomachenko. So put that in perspective. I gave you all these undefeated fighters in the lightweight division and did not even bring up Lomachenko until it was time to review his fight. So this division can be potentially the glamour division in boxing if it's done right by the promoters, if the fans take their time, let these guys build their name, let these guys keep fighting each other. Again, Ryan Garcia is a social media darling. Teofimo, I believe, actually has the best win out of all those guys beating Lomachenko. A lot of people don't know who Devin Haney is. Hardcore fight fans out of Europe, they know who Josh Taylor is. Shakur Stevenson is slowly starting to build a following. You have Lomachenko, but I would say now Davis is starting to be the biggest star, especially with the performance last Saturday, fighting a much larger opponent. His association and affiliation with Floyd Mayweather, he's getting that rub off of star power. So definitely some good things brewing in boxing. We definitely wanted to give our review of the fight and what we foresee things going. So until the next time, it's Chin Check Radio signing out.